What really happened to German soldiers after World War II? When the Reich collapsed in May 1945, millions of men in grey-green uniforms suddenly went from conquerors to captives, from soldiers to survivors. Some found themselves behind barbed wire, others were forced into back-breaking labour camps, and countless more returned home to a Germany that no longer existed as they had known it. Their fate was as fractured as the country itself. This is the untold story of what became of the German soldiers after the greatest war in history. And before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's forgotten chapters. The war ended not with a neat surrender, but with chaos. At the moment of capitulation, over 7 million German troops were scattered across Europe, many of them starving, exhausted, and in disarray. For the Allies, this was the largest mass surrender in history, and they had no clear plan to handle it. Soldiers who had once marched in disciplined ranks now trudged along dirt roads with their hands up, surrendering to anyone in sight, sometimes even to single Allied patrols, desperate simply to survive. For those captured in the West, conditions varied. The Americans and British established sprawling prisoner-of-war camps, but they were never prepared for the sheer numbers. In the famous Rhine meadow camps, hundreds of thousands of Germans were penned in open fields, surrounded by barbed wire, with no barracks, little food, and minimal medical care. Some prisoners dug holes in the ground to shield themselves from rain and cold. Survival depended on ration trucks, often delayed by destroyed infrastructure. Contemporary reports estimate tens of thousands died in these conditions, though exact numbers remain debated. In France, things were even tougher. The French government, still reeling from Nazi occupation, pressed captured Germans into forced labour to rebuild the shattered nation. Former soldiers were sent to repair roads, clear rubble, and most dangerously, to clear minefields left behind by their own armies. The mortality rate for these forced labourers was staggering. For many Germans, surrendering to the French meant trading one battlefield for another, this time unarmed and powerless. But if the West was grim, the East was nightmarish. The Soviet Union took an estimated 3 million German prisoners during and after the war. Their ordeal lasted not weeks or months, but years. Prisoners were loaded onto trains and shipped thousands of kilometers into the Soviet interior, to camps scattered across Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. There they laboured in forests, quarries, coal mines, and steelworks under freezing temperatures and brutal oversight. Food was meagre, disease rampant. Some men survived on little more than watery soup and scraps of bread. Out of those 3 million, nearly 1 million never returned. One of the most haunting stories is that of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. Over 90,000 Germans were captured after the catastrophic defeat in February 1943. Starving, frostbitten, and broken, they began their long march into captivity. Only around 5,000 ever made it back to Germany, less than 6%. Survivors trickled home a decade later, in the mid-1950s, old men compared to the youths who had once gone off to war. They became symbols of the suffering of the Heimkehrer, the returnees, whose ordeal lasted long after the guns had fallen silent. Meanwhile, soldiers who avoided captivity faced a different struggle. Millions attempted to slip back into civilian life, shedding uniforms, burning papers, and praying no one asked questions about their past. For ordinary Wehrmacht foot soldiers, this sometimes worked. But for members of the Waffen SS, things were different. The Allies considered the SS a criminal organisation responsible for war crimes and atrocities. Many SS men were executed, imprisoned, or barred from ever serving in public roles again. Others, however, managed to hide in plain sight, changing identities and vanishing into post-war society. For those who did come home, home was barely recognisable. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne were smouldering ruins. Families were torn apart. Some soldiers returned to find their wives and children missing, displaced, or killed in the Allied bombing campaigns. Others discovered strangers occupying their homes as millions of Germans were expelled from the East and resettled in what was left of Germany. Imagine surviving years of war only to find that the life you fought for no longer existed. In West Germany, reintegration was slow and uneasy. Veterans were at first viewed with suspicion, reminders of a defeated and disgraced past. Jobs were scarce, housing scarce, and trauma unspoken. Men who had commanded tanks or artillery were suddenly left to haul bricks in ruined cities. Yet, as the Cold War took shape, the United States and its allies began to see former Wehrmacht soldiers less as enemies and more as assets. By 1955, the Bundeswehr, West Germany's new army, was created. Carefully screened former Wehrmacht officers were recruited to provide experience and structure. Ironically, the same men who had fought against America and Britain were now being asked to defend democracy against the Soviet Union. In East Germany, the story was harsher. The communist regime distrusted veterans of Hitler's army. Former Wehrmacht soldiers were often denied positions, monitored by the Stasi, and kept on the margins of society. Instead, the East German government glorified communist resistance fighters as the true heroes. When the National People's Army was established, it was staffed primarily with a younger, ideologically loyal generation. For many veterans in the East, their wartime service became a stain that silenced them for life. The psychological toll was enormous. Today, we would call it PTSD, but in the 1940s and 50s, it had no name. Soldiers who had endured years of brutal combat, starvation, and captivity were expected to get on with it. Alcoholism soared, families fractured, and violence often lurked under the surface, yet in public, silence reigned. In West Germany, most veterans rarely spoke about their wartime experiences. In East Germany, silence wasn't just cultural, it was enforced. And then there were those who never returned at all. Millions of German families lived for decades with uncertainty. Was their father, brother, or son killed in combat? Was he rotting in a Soviet camp? Had he assumed a new identity somewhere far away? In some cases, it wasn't until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that families finally learned the truth through newly opened archives. By then, many mothers and wives had already gone to their graves, never knowing. Over time, German veterans organized into associations, lobbying for pensions and recognition. Some were hailed as survivors of a national tragedy, others were accused of whitewashing their past. Debates raged over whether the Wehrmacht had been honorable soldiers or complicit in Nazi crimes. Monuments were built, torn down, and rebuilt again. Even decades later, the legacy of these men remained politically and morally charged. And not every German soldier gave up on the war. Scattered groups of diehards formed underground networks, hiding weapons and dreaming of a Nazi revival. Allied authorities quickly crushed most of these movements, but their existence showed just how hard it was for some to accept total defeat. In the end, the vast majority of German soldiers did what soldiers in every war eventually do. They tried to live. They became farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers, fathers and grandfathers. Some even became leaders in politics, business and the military. Others carried their trauma silently to the grave. But together they formed the backbone of post-war Germany, a generation both burdened and defined by their past. So, what happened to German soldiers after World War II? They were imprisoned, worked to death, repurposed, silenced and scattered. Some were punished, others redeemed. Their fates were as varied as the war itself, but all of them lived in the shadow of a conflict that reshaped the world. Now I want to hear from you. Should these men be remembered only as instruments of Hitler's regime or as human beings caught in a tragedy beyond their control? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another journey into history's forgotten stories.